Will Putin eventually completely lose his marbles and start a nuclear war? This isn't just a hypothetical question, and here's why. Since the start of Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the omnipresent threat of nuclear escalation has loomed over the conflict like a dark cloud. When Russia's fortunes decline, the world tends to hold its breath. The rationality of the man with his finger on the nuclear button makes it hard to predict whether further defeat and embarrassment on the battlefield will drive him closer to a nuclear contingency. Now, with news emerging that Putin has officially revoked Russia's ratification of a global nuclear test ban, uncertainty is rising. Introduced in 1996, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, or CTBT, was designed to prevent all nuclear explosions worldwide, including those performed during a nuclear test. Having adhered to the ban for more than 2 decades, Putin's landmark about-face is worth keeping an eye on, the latest in a series of calculated moves to intimidate Ukraine and its Western supporters. Putin's decision underscores the paucity of military options available to him as his force is depleted and his regional military aims go unrealized. Sure, this could just be the type of nuclear saber-rattling that we've grown accustomed to, but the news could also prove catastrophic. With thousands of nuclear weapons in its arsenal, the resumption of nuclear testing by Russia is just the type of escalatory sign the world has hoped to avoid ever since the Russians invaded Ukraine in February of 2022. What was Russia's rationale for making this change? And what bearing might it have on the conflict in Ukraine and the future nuclear relations between the world's superpowers? First, Putin's rationale. Citing their own security interests, unsurprisingly, Russian leaders claim the decision was adopted in response to the United States' own blatant disregard for the global nuclear test ban. And technically they're right. Ironically, the US itself never ratified the CTBT when it was passed in 1996. To understand why, we should go back in time to understand why the CTBT came about in the first place. Introduced at the end of the Cold War, the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty imposed a global suspension on all nuclear testing above or below ground. It was proposed by UN mandate 33 years after the American and Soviet superpowers came dangerously close to mutually assured destruction during the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. In the immediate aftermath of that standoff, delegates from both nations entered into negotiations to sign a limited nuclear test ban treaty, an agreement which allowed nations to conduct underground nuclear tests but went so far as to prohibit nuclear experimentation underwater, in Earth's atmosphere, and in space. Signed by the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and the United States, at the time, the treaty was overwhelmingly supported by the American Senate, which approved it in an 80-19 margin. Many hailed the limited test ban treaty as the start of warming relations and closer cooperation between President John F. Kennedy's United States government and the Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev's communist regime. Indeed, it marked the first arms control agreement of the Cold War. No more radioactive fallout in the atmosphere, no more radioactive material in the ocean. Things were looking up. The limited test ban treaty was followed by further arms control agreements during the Cold War, including the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 1968 and the SALT I agreements of 1972. 2 years later, a threshold test ban treaty managed to further limit underground nuclear testing by constraining explosions to a maximum yield of 150 kilotons. According to the nuclear fireball calculator, that meant explosions with fireballs no more than 5.4 seconds long and a burst height of 1,022 meters. These piecemeal measures were touted as a success. The agreements were not only ecologically sound, they brought the two sides into dialogue, a helpful tool when you're trying to manage a major rivalry which could at any second endanger the survival of the entire human race. They restricted the number of nuclear missile silos and submarine-launched missile tubes. They helped keep hundreds of non-nuclear signatories, non-nuclear. And they established hotlines between the two countries which came in handy during the period of détente in the 1970s. The problem was that they never fully got over the line. They could not lead the superpowers into general disarmament, the ultimate aim of nuclear arms control after all. Both superpowers remained hell-bent on achieving nuclear superiority over the other after the treaties at almost any cost. It was the best way to maintain one's killer edge during the Cold War. This meant the development of newer, deadlier delivery systems and launch platforms, including strategic bombers and better nuclear submarines, whose testing and use were still largely unregulated. These issues were supposed to be addressed at the SALT II agreements, but before it could pass, tensions once again overshadowed negotiations. The Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, no surprise there, and the Carter administration responded by funding Mujahideen resistance, also no surprise, pulling out of the 1980 Moscow Olympics and putting a general freeze on the SALT II negotiations. Then followed the well-known Reaganite reforms, a sweeping military modernization program which again turned the Cold War on its head and rekindled tension between the two powers. In turn, NATO began deploying advanced Pershing II missiles in Western Europe, more than capable of striking key targets in Russia, causing widespread anti-nuclear protests throughout Europe. Doubling down, Reagan resists appeasement to the Soviet Union, labeling it the evil empire. He sponsors the Strategic Defensive Initiative, SDI, a space-based ballistic missile shield that could protect against a Soviet nuclear attack. The Soviets, overwhelmed by economic setbacks, grow increasingly wary of a widening technological gap with the West. And then Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev and Reagan became, well, frenemies, I guess. At a short-notice summit in Iceland in 1986, they agreed to virtually abolish their nuclear arsenals over the next 10 years. But the Soviets, irritated with the Americans' disregard of a pre-existing treaty limiting the testing required to pursue the SDI, blocked the passage of any agreement at Reykjavik. It took 5 long years to get anything across the line, but after agreeing to a joint US-Soviet program to research underground test detection in December 1987, in 1991, the two returned to center stage and passed the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces (INF) Treaty, which basically did away with ground-launched mid-range nuclear missiles. It's the first agreement to reduce nuclear arms, as opposed to settling ceilings, and it introduced comprehensive verification measures, an important turning point for the negotiations to come. So by the time you get to the end of the Cold War, you have accelerating US-Soviet disarmament talks and a general spirit of optimism pervading their old Cold War stomping grounds. The 1990 START Treaty managed to reduce each side's massive arsenal of more than 10,000 warheads to less than 6,000 by 2009. They were increasingly inspecting each other's underground testing facilities and capabilities, and there was hopes the world might be able to come to some sort of overarching agreement on nuclear disarmament. Then things sort of got complicated. Conditions to pursue a long-term comprehensive test ban were ripe in the mid-1990s. In 1993, the United Nations initiated negotiations. It took 3 years to thrash out a viable treaty draft. And while in 1996 the United States General Assembly managed to adopt the CTBT with 71 signatories, a number which has grown to 177 by November 2023, 3 of the 8 nuclear-capable states signed but never ratified the treaty. And that's where we get into Putin's alleged rationale for backing Russia out of its own ratification of the treaty. You see, while Russia was among the 5 nuclear-capable states at the time to ratify the CTBT in 1996, the United States wasn't. This put them in, well, shall we say, interesting company. Joining them are India, North Korea, China, Iran, Egypt, Israel, and Pakistan. Lacking the signature of the lone global superpower, the treaty was seen as more of a guideline than anything binding. While much of the world has maintained the CTBT's ban on nuclear explosions, it hasn't stopped rogue states like North Korea from experimenting from time to time. So why didn't the United States ratify the CTBT? Wasn't it in their best interest? Well, they certainly tried. In order to ratify the treaty, the United States had to pass it through the Senate first. Maybe you're getting Wilsonian flashbacks of the failed bid to approve American participation in the League of Nations after World War I, and it was a similar sort of outcome here too. Senate Republicans delayed bringing the CTBT to a vote for 3 years until July 1999, when all 45 Senate Democrats signed a letter demanding that it receive a hearing and a vote. The Republicans predictably ignored them. It took a threat from Democratic Senator Byron Dorgan to impede all Senate business until it was brought to vote to get the desired result. And so it went to a vote. Senate Republicans weren't too scared. They felt they had all the votes they needed to block the CTBT, so they agreed immediately. This took Senate Democrats and the White House off guard, making provisions for 18 hours of debate under the agreement that both parties would only be able to introduce a single amendment to the bill Senate Democrats further inflamed their Republican peers by hobbling their ability to bring up various concerns they might have had about the bill. They, in turn, basically sabotaged the bill so that it would not pass. When it went to a vote, the ratification of the CTBT was defeated 51-48. The Republicans weren't acting out of sheer spite, though it may seem like that. They had several primary concerns that prevented them from fully supporting ratification. Foremost among them, they feared the US simply could not maintain a reliable nuclear arsenal, the bedrock of its deterrence against revisionist superpowers like Russia and China today, without the provision of future testing. Second, they rightly lacked confidence that foreign cheaters could be adequately detected. Measures were adopted after the signing of the treaty aimed at promoting the safety and reliability of American nuclear tests. They stopped underground testing, shifting their focus to maintaining the arsenals they currently possessed. Among them was the Stockpile Stewardship Program, which enabled the US to continue testing its nuclear arsenal, the last warhead having been constructed in 1992, in tightly managed facilities capable of replicating heat and pressure conditions when a nuclear weapon is detonated, but without the actual blast itself. Since the youngest American nuke is actually at least 30 years old, mitigating risk of failure is a real concern. The US has not tested nuclear weapons since 1992, which leaves the task of its stockpile maintenance to the use of simulations, using non-nuclear explosive tests and supercomputers among other methods, and other science-based solutions. Maintaining America's nuclear credibility is therefore a complex, expensive, and daunting task, one for which it is dependent on continued testing if it's to preserve its existing stockpiles without having to resort to building more. Still, since 1996, the directors of the National Nuclear Laboratory and the Commander of Strategic Command, responsible for the nation's nuclear deterrent, have both had to annually certify their confidence in America's nuclear reliability, and since then, both have claimed there is little need for further testing, casting doubt over the failure to ratify the CTBT. Doubts over cheating are also questionable. The CTBT maintains its own UN-sponsored global monitoring system, paid for and maintained by all partner nations. With almost 300 surveillance stations across the world, the monitoring system can detect a nuclear test with a yield as low as 1 kiloton. Several American agencies, including the National Academy of Sciences, have expressed satisfaction with this monitoring system, claiming it can even detect a 0.1 to 0.2 kiloton explosion. As pronounced as they were in the mid-1990s, by 2016, concerns over cheating no longer held sway as Republicans continued to resist ratification of the treaty. Failure to back the CTBT has damaged US credibility on the global stage. Today, Russia is using that failure as fuel for its own decision to revoke its ratification of the treaty. There's never a good time to back out of nuclear arms treaties, but especially today when Russian state stability has never been in greater doubt, when its ties to other revisionist and experimental nuclear powers like Iran are being increasingly strengthened, and as their disregard for the liberal international order grows. Iran is believed to have enriched uranium to 86% after President Donald Trump revoked the Iranian nuclear deal. Many fear a test could occur at any time. Even more damaging, Iran could skip the testing process and covertly build out its own nuclear arsenal under the noses of the world's major powers, and before they could do much to stop it. Needless to say, this would be a calamity of the first order. Escalating tensions with Iran's regional adversaries, Jordan and Saudi Arabia, who have promised to pursue nuclear programs of their own if Iran succeeds. Peace is always fleeting in the Middle East, but it becomes almost unimaginable if any power in that region gains access to a nuclear warhead. Further east, Pakistan and India are enveloped in age-old tensions of their own. Border skirmishes continue. It wouldn't take much for either side to return to nuclear tests as a way of intimidating the other. Signing into law the withdrawal of its ratification of the CTBT, Russian politicians claim the decision was made in their own self-interest, and in their words, as a mirror response to the actions of the United States. The claims fall short of credibility, especially as nuclear threats and active violations of neighbors' territorial sovereignty have gone hand in hand over the past few years. It's all rhetoric. Russia knows it cannot resort to nuclear weapons because it knows it cannot handle the consequences. It would jeopardize its alliance with China. It would further galvanize the West. it would put its entire population at risk. Not that that last part matters much to Putin. You probably remember when Putin and his lackeys started threatening to rain down tactical nuclear destruction on the Ukrainian battlefield. Well, the United States didn't take kindly to that. They immediately initiated a back-channel conversation with Russia's defense minister, and almost miraculously, the threats ceased shortly thereafter. It's impossible to know what they said, but it shed light on one of Putin's few remaining cards: his repeated attempts to bully the West into inaction and limit Western intervention by threatening to put his nuclear forces on high alert. The announcement threw the Western media into a frenzy, but of course achieved little of its true intended effect. No matter what Putin says, Western nuclear weapons will continuously remain in a state of high alert, and barring an actual nuclear strike, the West will continue to ferry weapons and aid into Ukraine. Perhaps thinking his threats did not go far enough, Putin then thought it would be a good idea to move some of his nuclear weapons into Belarus. Again, this was just a ploy to stoke Western fears. What it really achieved was bringing Russian nukes into closer range of NATO's rapid response and first strike forces, and conferred virtually no advantage in targeting NATO cities or bases, besides shaving a minute off their flight time. Really, this renewed threat only brought down more pressure on the shaky Lukashenko government in Belarus and brought them into closer proximity to Russian mercenary groups which had traditionally operated out of that region. Putin remains a master strategist. In light of past threats, Russia's departure from the CTBT may indeed be another failed attempt at fearmongering. The scope and extent of Russia's ability to conduct its own nuclear tests are relatively unknown, but it's likely they are not as clear-cut as Putin would hope. Like the US, Putin must navigate significant legal hurdles to do so. In light of the hundreds of millions of rubles being sunk into the war in Ukraine, it's unlikely Putin's autocratic regime even possesses the financial resources required to greenlight modern testing or produce additional nuclear weapons, a process which not only includes the purchasing of the bomb itself, but the purchase and maintenance of delivery systems, equipment, personnel, and secure renovated facilities. The world would almost certainly apply even greater economic pressure if a test were detected. What's more, ex-Soviet citizens living near old test ranges simply don't want them to resume. It's true that a nuclear test might signal to the West what idle threats cannot: Putin's commitment to putting his money where his mouth is. After announcing its intention to reverse its ratification of the CTBT, just recently Russia announced a successful submarine test launch of one of its Bulava intercontinental ballistic missiles expressly designed to deliver a nuclear warhead to a target. There was obviously no warhead attached, but such public displays fall into the category of threat we've all grown accustomed to. Russia's accompanying withdrawal from the CTBT only heightens global insecurity and lends such threats marginally more weight. NATO has pledged not to be deterred by nuclear blackmail and vowed to increase support of Ukraine in light of such provocations. But the nuclear slope is a slippery one. The West must stand resolutely opposed to nuclear blackmail and terrorism. If Putin gets his way, the rest of the world feel emboldened to disregard the types of collaborative treaties that have helped keep nuclear warheads out of combat since 1945. Even likelier, random tests and shows of force could backfire on Putin. Would anyone really be surprised if news comes out that an ex-Soviet warhead randomly detonated in an unreliable silo, or if a threat to nuke Ukraine somehow went awry and they accidentally nuked themselves? Putin is running a real risk of alienating those few nations from which he still somehow enjoys support. The world has not forgotten the terror of the Cold War. Everyone on the planet knows that a nuclear exchange will have severe ramifications even in the most remote areas. After so much bloodshed, instability, and uncertainty, Putin launching a nuke on Ukraine, mishandling a nuclear test, or creating a nuclear disaster in his own country could be the straw that breaks the camel's back. While the United States presses forward developing cutting-edge testing methods which can simulate and study the final stages of a nuclear weapon implosion short of an actual detonation, giving them accurate insight on how its 30-year-old weapons will operate and when it's time to replace them, Russia will resort to the cheaper and far more destabilizing option. Where that leads is anyone's guess, but it won't be anywhere good. But what do you think? Is Putin starting a nuclear war an actual risk, or will sanity prevail even when, and we do believe it's when, not if, he is ultimately defeated in the Ukraine conflict, Let us know in the comments and don't forget to subscribe for more military analysis from military experts.